the only reason they even received that high of a score was because they were technically sound. But technically sound in the same way that a hot dog is technically a sandwich. A lot of you commented on my sci-fi Triple Crown video and you're interested in hearing about what I think about each of the books on that list. So here we are. So I have a few corrections to start off with that people brought my attention to from the last video. I used the word committee to refer to the voters of the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Locus awards. Out of those three award groups, we'll call them, only the Nebulas are awarded by a committee. Also, turns out that the gods themselves did win all three awards, but not in the same year. Last but not least, I have a 5-part weighted rating system. Writing quality accounts for 25%. Story/plot accounts for 25%. Characters account for 10%. Theme/impact counts for another 10%, and then my own personal enjoyment of the story counts for another 30%. Each of those categories breaks down into 3 to 6 individual metrics that I rate, sum, and average. I'm not going to go into further detail here, but I guess if you guys want a full breakdown of my rating system, I might make a video about that too. All right, finally, let's get started, shall we? So I couldn't find an ebook version for Ringworld, so I had to settle for an audiobook version, and I really don't like audiobooks, so this did contribute a little bit to my lack of enjoyment for it, but I did not hold this against the novel. This novel was just decent overall. There were hardly any moments, if any at all, in which I felt truly excited to continue to read, to find out what happens. I never once got that, oh, I can't put this book down feeling. There wasn't enough in the way of good dialogues, monologues, tense or exciting plot points, or even wonder. Instead of being able to enjoy the plot as it unfolded, I felt like a 7th grader trying to understand a doctoral thesis on physics. I could understand most, if not all, of the grander picture, but the smaller details were lost on me. And because the details were a large part of the novel, it made for a confusing and mostly unenjoyable experience for me. Now, I'm not saying that this book is bad, I'm just saying that it wasn't for me. I'm not smart enough to keep up with it. Also, I'm not very good at spatial visualization, so a lot of the descriptions just ended up confusing me. So I did think the characters and the plot of this novel were great, but that was about it. I actually have a full review of this novel up on my YouTube page. Moving on to the gods themselves. So what I disliked about this novel were the incomplete storylines and then the giant plot hole towards the end of it. Spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read this novel. So in this novel, Asimov suggests through a few of his characters that it would be possible for the Earth and the Moon to leave each other's orbits without any significant detrimental effects on either celestial body.
Isn't that cute? But it's wrong!
No mention of the fact that the Moon is responsible for things like tides, axial stability, and basic planetary balance. If this were a Star Wars style soft sci-fi book, I would have probably let it slide. I think Asimov typically aims for scientific plausibility, which is something that I think all sci-fi authors should do. But this wasn't even scientifically plausible. This is just straight impossibility. And this is disappointing coming from my personal favorite sci-fi author. But despite those issues, the gods themselves actually had some fantastic moments. The writing is sharp, humorous, and engaging. The dialogue is stimulating and intelligent. And I felt that the alien world building was unique and progressive for its time. Me and my friends have often joked about how our minds seem to function better due to post-nut clarity. Well, Asimov actually found a hilariously clever way to incorporate this into this novel. I did a full review of this novel as well. So moving on to Rendezvous with Rama, my major gripe with this novel is the fact that for the first 40% of it, not much happens. And I'm somebody who appreciates a good setup, a good slow burn, but it just wasn't exciting. It was boring for the most part. Like I was flat out bored for like half of this novel. But then once you reach the 60% point, it just takes off. It gets really, really good. So good that I actually finished the series. Moving on to the Dispossessed.
素晴らしい.
I'm not even sure what I liked best about this novel. I'm not sure if it was a social commentary, the philosophical monologues and dialogues, or how much of myself I saw in some of the characters, especially Shevik. I love how balanced the ideas in this novel were. It felt like Ursula wasn't trying to force an opinion on me, but rather she presented me with two different sides of an argument and let me decide which one I felt was the most substantial. On to the bad. My immediate thoughts is that I really disliked the ending of that novel. There were some pretty significant and minor plot points that were just left up in the air, and that just pissed me off. I was like, what happened to this character? What happened to that character? How is this all gonna end up? I didn't like any of that. Moving on to the Forever War. So a few things that I did like about this novel. The scientific exploration, the use of time dilation. I really like the, touching upon the military industrial complex. I like the accessibility of the novel. I liked how it was a good mix of hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi. Now, what I feel like was its glaring weakness was the brevity of the novel. I feel like it was far too short to really expand upon and go deep on all of the topics and themes and plot points and narratives that it brought up. There just wasn't enough space in such a short book to really tackle anything deeply. However, I did find out that the Forever War is actually the first book in a series, so maybe these things were tackled in greater detail in the subsequent novels. So moving on to Gateway by Friedrich Pohl.
Good, not great.
This novel has psychological depth, decent supporting characters, and intriguing world building, but overall, I just felt like this novel was good. I compare my experience with this novel to catching a movie on TV on a lazy Sunday when I don't really have much else to do. It was good enough to pass the time and keep me entertained, but it's not something I would seek out or revisit in the future. The most annoying thing about the novel was the inclusion of the random mission reports and the expedition journals. I get that they were probably put there to add more context and detail about the Hichi and the universe itself, but for me, I just feel like they provided more questions than answers. Moving on to Dream Snake. This novel has so much potential for me. The concept of a herpetological sci-fi was really intriguing to me, and I really wanted this novel to be better than it was. Snakes are actually my favorite animals, but alas, the novel let me down.
I was rooting for you! We were all rooting for you!
The ending was rushed, the romance was forced, the resolution to the final big conflict felt so forced. I felt like I was watching a shonen anime or reading a young adult novel. Also, the lack of scientific depth in this novel made it feel like sci-fi light. Moving on to Startide Rising. I enjoyed this novel. It was a great read. Now, I don't quite feel like it was as exceptional or good as Speaker for the Dead or The Dispossessed, but I would put it above the gods themselves. I would describe Startide Rising as very good with a few great or even excellent moments. One of its greatest strengths to me was the fact that it's zoological sci-fi. And like I've said before, I really love zoology. I love biology, nature, all of that stuff. So of course this novel appealed to me. What I found most annoying about this novel is that pretty much as soon as the novel starts, you're just inundated with a whole bunch of information. Different names, terms, definitions, all of that. And then here we have Speaker for the Dead. It's hard for me to decide which novel I enjoyed more out of Speaker for the Dead and The Dispossessed. I want to give the edge to Speaker for the Dead, but then at the same time, I just relate to Shevik so heavily that it's close. It's very close, but they're both exceptional novels that shot up to like my top 10, top 20 novels that I've ever read instantly.
Lord have mercy, I'm about to bust.
The prose is poetic, the inner monologues and the dialogues are deep and poignant. The journal entries that open up each chapter are especially strong and give an overall reflective rhythm to the novel that reminds me of Doom. As Doom did a similar thing with the beginning of each chapter. The only significant flaw, if you can even call it that, was the first 20% of the novel being so dense with names, context, and history. So it takes a bit of time for you to really settle in and get going. But besides that, fantastic. Doomsday book. This is one of the worst novels that I've read in a long time. It was boring and unengaging for 99% of its duration. Spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read this novel. Something I found really odd was the fact that they had time travel capabilities and advanced medical capabilities in some respects, but nothing else about that civilization or society seemed to be advanced at all. American Gods. So I didn't rate this novel for two reasons. One, I forgot, and two, I had already seen a season or two of the television adaptation, so I already had preconceived notions about the story, and I wouldn't have been able to have formed a fair and unbiased opinion of it. So yeah, the novel felt like an adult version of the Percy Jackson series, but in a good way, actually. I would say its biggest strength was the fact that even though the characters weren't very fleshed out, just due to the power of, I guess, Neil Gaiman's writing and the way the story was constructed, I still felt like I knew each character. There was a very graphic sex scene in this novel that I actually enjoyed, which is extremely rare for me because I don't like smut in my media. But this one wasn't smut, and I enjoyed it in a literary way because it was actually necessary to the plot of the story rather than it feeling like it was just shoehorned in for sexual entertainment. That being said, I found this novel to be very interesting, but not very entertaining or enjoyable. It had its moments, but overall I felt like this novel really leaned into and maybe even relied heavily on intrigue, mystery and clever writing without actually providing much in the way of, an enjoyable experience, at least for me. I didn't like that the novel left me in the dark for so long. I didn't know what was going on and where I was headed for a long time, despite the fact that I have seen quite a bit of the TV adaptation. Also, I really didn't like the way the soft magic system was used in this novel. It felt lazy to me. It was very unsatisfying. It just felt like he wanted to allow himself the freedom to let his characters do whatever convenient magical mumbo jumbo he wanted them to be able to do at the time, and then just ignore those powers at other times. Paladin of Souls. So my apologies for what I said in the last video. I actually didn't read this novel because I had to read the previous novel before it, and I didn't like the previous novel. I DNF'd it, so I actually didn't end up making it to Paladin of Souls. Not much, if anything, happened that entertained me or really interested me in that novel. The Yiddish Policeman's Union. So I DNF'd this novel for much of the same reason that I DNF'd the last novel. I also feel like this novel was written primarily for a Jewish audience or people who had a good grasp on Jewish culture. And that's just not me. The Wind-Up Girl.
Could have done better, but he might have done worse.
This novel had a slow but interesting start. Things didn't really begin to pick up till about 60% of the way in. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't great either. I liked the idea of it, but I felt like the execution was lacking all around. It didn't excel in any major metric for me. All clear. I didn't even bother reading this novel for the same reasons I stated with the last novel, Blackout and Doomsday. I likely will never read anything by Connie Willis ever again.
His hair, whack. His gear, whack. His jewelry, whack. His footsteps, whack. The way that he talks, whack. The way that he doesn't even like to smile, whack.
Ancillary Justice. The climax and the way this novel ended wasn't really all that great to me. I felt like this novel had a great plot and I liked what it was trying to do. I just felt like the execution was lacking, especially regarding the writing. I also think that the timeline, as well as the way that the information was conveyed, was unnecessarily confusing. I often found myself trying to figure out who was speaking and to whom. The Stone Sky. So I read this novel back in 2021 before I had the rating system that I do now. I enjoyed this novel, but it wasn't amazing to me, and I actually think the first novel in this series is better than this last one. One thing that I think that this novel and the series as a whole did very well was its approach to inclusivity. The queer and POC characters weren't written in a way in which I felt was pandering. They were simply characters that happened to be people of color or queer. I love when Black characters are just well-written Black characters as opposed to a mouthpiece for for some thesis on Black suffering and the Black struggle and all of that. The Calculating Stars. Out of all the novels that I read on this list, this one had the strongest start. Right out of the gate, this novel was witty, funny, engaging, and it made me connect to and care for the characters almost immediately. I truly can't remember the last time a novel had me this locked in this fast. However, that was just the start. As the novel progressed towards the midpoint and towards the end, it didn't quite have me as hooked. I had two big issues with this novel. One, I didn't like the fact that the novel shifted from sci-fi to being about racism and sexism and the anxiety of the main character. It's not even that I have a problem with any of those topics. I just don't think that this novel handled them particularly well. My second gripe is how many physically intimate moments were in this story.
Whoa, mama! Get a room, you two!
It was way too much for me. It wasn't at the level of smut. It was just too much for me. And now we have Network Effect, which I DNF'd at 29% of the way in. You have to understand, it's not that Network Effect was that horrible, it's that I had to read 4 novellas in the series preceding Network Effect before getting to this one. And by that time, I was kind of checked out. Not a single one of the Murderbot stories received an overall rating higher than a 3.38 from me.
Cause every single thing in it is mid!
And the only reason they even received that high of a score was because they were technically sound. But technically sound in the same way that a hot dog is technically a sandwich. The humor in this series was puerile and not even in like any sort of good way. It was corny, similar to that last Wolverine and Deadpool movie. I didn't enjoy it at all. The entire series kind of felt like it was written for a teenage girl. Well, that's all folks. I know this is a long video, but you guys asked for it and I'm nothing if not thorough, so stay lit. Thanks for watching.